I want that you watch again this video about the electron transport chain that I think is very useful for you, that it summarizes all the process.
During glycolysis and the tricarboxylic acid cycle, oxidation of organic molecules results in production of reduced coenzymes such as NADH. These coenzymes transfer hydrogens to the electron transport chain, which is located in the bacterial cell membrane. A hydrogen consists of a proton and an electron. The electron transport chain consists of a series of special electron carrier proteins that shuttle electrons from NADH to a terminal electron acceptor, such as oxygen. Electrons enter the electron transport chain when NADH transfers its protons plus electrons to a membrane-embedded carrier protein. The electrons are sequentially carried along the electron transport chain while the protons are shuttled to the outside of the membrane. Some of the electron carriers, such as coenzyme Q, accept a proton from the inside of the cell membrane as it accepts electrons. The proton is then transported through the membrane as electrons move down the chain. This increases the proton gradient across the membrane and enhances the proton motive force. During aerobic respiration, the last carrier protein transfers a pair of electrons to oxygen at the end of the electron transport chain, and water is formed. The enzyme Atp Synthase utilizes the energy of the proton motive force to synthesize ATP. This enzyme allows protons to pass back into the cell and couples the energy released in this process to the phosphorylation of ADP to form ATP.
Now that you watched the video, I'm just going to give you few key points that they could be in the questionnaire or they could be in the test. So one important thing that I wanted you to remember is that the mitochondria has three main compartments. One is the intermembrane space, and here is where you have all the hydrogen will be, all these protons will be located. All these protons will be located there. On the other hand, the inner mitochondrial membrane is the place where all the transport change, all these proteins complex will be located. And finally, the mitochondrial matrix is the place where the protons will be moved to produce the ATP. So remember, the electron transport chain is located in the inner mitochondrial membrane. Second thing that maybe you already know that you're watching the video is that if you see here, you have one complex here. Here you have multiple proteins. Here you have the complex 3. Here is the complex 2. Here is the complex 4. So you have a lot of proteins. So in this electron transport chain, most of the chain components include proteins, which exist in a multi-protein complex. And as you watch in the video, these proteins, these electron carriers are alternating between being reduced and oxidized as they accept and donate electrons. And we will watch a video about that in a second. So in this video, they explain in a lot of detail the changes in free energy that allow this electron transport change that later will end up in the production of water. So let's start that video.
Free energy change during electron transport. During glycolysis and the citric acid cycle, electrons from food molecules are transferred to NAD+ and FAD, forming NADH and FADH2. These electron carriers bring electrons to the electron transport chain in the inner mitochondrial membrane. There, the energy of electrons is converted to a form that powers the synthesis of ATP. Let's take a closer look at just the electron transport chain. The overall function of the electron transport chain is to receive electrons from NADH and FADH2 and move them through a series of redox reactions. When the electrons are in the NADH and FADH2 molecules, they have a relatively high energy level, and they lose a little free energy with each redox exchange. In this figure, purple shapes represent compounds that transfer electrons down the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain is made up of 4 protein complexes, a smaller cytochrome protein, and an organic molecule called ubiquinone, or Q for short. This figure doesn't show the actual positions of the compounds in the inner mitochondrial membrane. Instead, they're on a graph that shows the free energy level of each compound relative to the free energy level of the oxygen molecule O2. Each arrow is one step of the pathway, one redox reaction. Overall, you can see that the arrows are heading downward on the graph as the electrons are passed from the first compound, NADH, to the last compound, an oxygen molecule. The electrons are becoming lower in energy as they move from compound to compound, releasing free energy with each step. Of the following compounds, which one contains the lowest energy electrons? FMN, cytochrome C, or cytochrome A3? Cytochrome A3 is lower on the graph than FMN or cytochrome C, so it has the lowest energy electrons of these 3 compounds. Notice that if NADH donated its electrons directly to oxygen, 53 kilocalories of free energy per mole of NADH would be released all at once. In the electron transport chain, however, that free energy is released in smaller amounts, which is later used to make ATP. Let's focus in on the first redox reaction of the electron transport chain. NADH donates its electrons to protein complex 1, which has a flavoprotein with a prosthetic group called FMN. This redox reaction reduces the flavoprotein and oxidizes NADH to NAD+. Why do the electrons move in that direction? FMN has a higher affinity for electrons than NADH does. In other words, FMN is a better acceptor of electrons than NADH. It's a better oxidizing agent. In removing electrons from NADH, FMN becomes reduced itself by gaining electrons. The next protein in complex 1 is called the Fes protein because its prosthetic group contains iron with the element symbol Fe and sulfur with the element symbol S. The Fes protein, in turn, is a better electron acceptor than FMN, so it takes electrons from FMN in the next redox reaction. Each compound in the electron transport chain functions in a similar way, by accepting electrons and then passing electrons along to the next compound in the chain. Now let's look at another redox reaction farther down the chain. Cytochrome C1 donates electrons to cytochrome C. Immediately after the electrons have been passed from cytochrome C1 to cytochrome C, is cytochrome C1 in its oxidized or its reduced state? And is cytochrome C in its oxidized or its reduced state? Immediately after the electrons have been passed from cytochrome C1 to cytochrome C, cytochrome C1 is in its oxidized state because it lost electrons, and cytochrome C is in its reduced state because it gained electrons. Cytochrome C then passes its electrons onto cytochrome A, which passes them on to cytochrome A3. At the end of the electron transport chain, the oxygen molecule O2 is the final electron acceptor of all of the past electrons. Once an oxygen atom in O2 has gained 2 electrons, it picks up 2 protons from the solution in the mitochondrion and becomes water. All mitochondria require a constant supply of oxygen in order to keep electrons moving along the electron transport chains.
So to summarize, they were talking about all the multiple steps, how the electrons give up free energy, and as they have so many steps, they stop moving through the change, and they ultimately donate the oxygen forming water. Now I'm going to give you a few more concepts. I want that you remember that, as we said before, as you're watching the video, this NADH and FADH pass to a series of electron carriers. In this case, it will be all these complex, including the cytochromes, and they finally, at the end, they go here. And remember, here you will get the protons, all the protons, but the electrons are looking forward to go here to form water. So you will have hydrogen positive and hydrogen positive here and hydrogen negative, and those one will be the electrons of the hydrogen will be the one that go here and form the molecule of water, and the other ones will be the one in charge. The protons are the one in charge of producing the exergonic flow that is going to produce the ATP in this reaction. So first concept, all these NADH and FADH pass to all these electron carriers, including the cytochromes, to arrive here to the oxygen. And however, this is not producing ATP. What is producing ATP? The electron transport change is not producing ATP directly. What is producing ATP? It will be the ATP synthase here at the end. And we will talk in the following slide about that.